Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Center for Teaching and Learning Skill Up series webinar. So as you can see, our format has changed just a tiny bit. I'm still the same old Emily Sprenger from the academic training position in the CTL, but we have moved our series to be in a meeting format in Zoom. So one of the nice things is that there's the ability to see each other as students, staff, and faculty, and maybe a little bit more communication and collaboration between students, staff, and faculty as well too through these series. But the goal, of course, is to provide you with tools and strategies for academic success in your journey. That being said, although you do have the ability to unmute, please do remain muted until called upon. We'll be able to pause and take questions as time permits. As always, we are recording our webinar, and I will post it on our YouTube's channel for future reference. We would ask you to post your questions in the chat. Now, keep in mind, there are many of you on the call, so if I happen to miss something, please provide me the grace and just give me a reminder in the chat. Say, hey, Emily, look above, question above. And then we will pause as Dr. Bloomberg sees fit throughout her presentation. Today, Dr. Bloomberg comes to us to present the fundamentals of qualitative research, and it's going to be a broad overview. So I think with all of those housekeeping items out of our way at the moment, I'd really like to turn this over to Dr. Linda Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Emily. As always, I'm very excited to be here and so grateful that the CTL and you provide these resources for our students. I'm always happy to present on qualitative research, which many of you know is a passionate area of mine. So that said, Emily is correct. Today's presentation is the fundamentals of qualitative research, a broad overview. And just so that you know, on the 2nd of February next year, Dr. Janet Boberg and I will be presenting on qualitative research designs, which will be a much more specific focus than this. So this one is kind of a precursor to the next one. And I very greatly welcome you to attend the other one as well. So welcome here, and I really do appreciate all of your participation today. What we're going to do, and the way that Emily and I have worked this over a number of years, is that I'm going to proceed through my presentation and stop at various strategic points for questions. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat. Emily's going to collect them. I actually don't see them until Emily presents them. So I see a very different view than you, and I can really just see my screen with some of the participants down the side. So that said, please do feel free to post whatever questions or thoughts or comments that you have as you go along. Every question is important. I learn as much from these presentations as you learn, and that really is the truth. I learn so much from students' perspectives and students' views on things. And that's part of the great benefit for me of presenting. So put all your questions in there. We'll get to them all. If we don't get to them by the end of the presentation, all the questions, then I always welcome questions by email, and I'm happy to answer them that way. So let's have a look at what I hope to achieve in today's webinar. And I really would like to put qualitative research in context in terms of the following points. One is describe the logic behind the choice of qualitative research and the defining features and research paradigms or worldviews on which qualitative research is based. Second, I'm going to outline the main characteristics or features of qualitative research. Then I'm going to emphasize the centrality of the researcher as a reflective practitioner. Researcher reflexivity is a very key and integral part of qualitative research, because the researcher is the instrument of the research itself. And we're going to get to that in more detail. And then finally, I'm going to review the evolving landscape of qualitative research, outlining the various historical moments, as they're called, and the key trends in the field. So I hope with all of that, you're going to come away today with a much broader and somewhat deeper understanding of what constitutes qualitative research as a field. And then on the 2nd of February, when Dr. Boberg and I present, we're going to be delving much more into the qualitative research designs that are also called traditions or genres. And those are like case study, narrative inquiry, phenomenology, ethnography, action research, all of those sort of designs. So I'm not going to be going into detail in those today. We're going to be looking rather at these 4 broad areas of qualitative research. So to start, I just want to point out that qualitative research was not always well accepted, and it was often considered the stepchild of research because quantitative research goes way further back in history and was considered the gold standard for many years. So when qualitative research came about, it was considered a less rigorous method, and researchers had to make a very convincing argument as to the legitimacy of this methodology. Because qualitative research cannot be objective, quantitative research considered this a methodology that lacked rigor. But as we know today, that is not the case. A qualitative study can be as rigorous as a quantitative study in very different ways. We don't look at reliability and validity, for example, but we do look at criteria of trustworthiness, which include credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And we're going to be getting to that. So no longer should qualitative research be considered a second best option to do a research study. In fact, the world of qualitative research has expanded dramatically in the last 20 or so years. There are hundreds of books and articles and a great many very well-respected researchers that write in this area. The people that developed qualitative research right in the beginning, like Norman Danzon and Guber and Lincoln, are still around, still writing, and still very well respected in the field of research. And as you know, all universities, including national, do offer students the opportunity to consider whether they want to take on a qualitative or a quantitative study. So that is also a matter of personal preference and the way that one wants to actually go along in your research endeavors, because both of them are very different tracks, as you know. So even though qualitative research is much more acceptable and accepted today, and there's much less of what we call the paradigm wars, that is the 2 wars between the qualitative and the quantitative, there's no longer that going on anymore. But that does not mean that a qualitative researcher still does not have to provide very strong and solid reasons or justification for using a qualitative research methodology. So that is very important. If you're conducting a qualitative study, as if you were conducting a quantitative, you have to make a strong argument or case for why you've chosen that methodology. And that has to make sense. It has to fit with your research problem, your research purpose, and your research questions. So that's another thing to consider. It's all very well saying, I want to do a qualitative study or I would like to do a quantitative study, but it very much depends on the kind of study that you're looking to do. Some studies are better suited to qualitative and some studies are better suited to quantitative. And that is something that you would work with your chair and your dissertation committee to decide on what is the best journey to embark on. But before you start a qualitative study, as with a quantitative, you do need to be oriented to the basic features of this methodology. And that's what I'm going to hope to cover in this presentation today. So let's take a look at the defining features of qualitative research. Qualitative methods, which are data analysis and data collection methods, rely on text and imagery. And there are unique steps that are taken in terms of data collection and data analysis. Very, very different to quantitative, which is all based on numbers, percentages, frequencies, means, medians, etc. Qualitative research is suited to promoting a deep understanding of a social or cultural phenomenon from the view of the research participants. And that's really important. This is not about the researcher. It's about what the researcher can uncover in terms of the experience and perspectives of the research participants themselves. The researcher is just the storyteller. The researcher collects the data, analyzes the data, and then tells the story from the perspective of the research participants. And the word representation is very important here because representing the research participants' experience authentically and with honesty is really what lies at the core of qualitative research. So the emphasis is on exploration, discovery, description of this phenomenon or experience that the researcher is seeking to explore and better understand. And those 2 words, explore and understand, are really what qualitative research is all about. It's about exploring and better understanding or developing a deeper understanding of a phenomenon out there in the social or cultural world that is worthy of research. that is worthy of further investigation so that people can have a better understanding or grasp of what is really going on. Now, quantitative research, as I'm sure all of you know, is applied to current situations to investigate relationships and study essentially cause-effect phenomena. Qualitative research is not about cause and effect. It's more about a deeper understanding. So I'm just going to read what I wrote. And Emily, I've got a problem because these pictures are just in the way. Okay, that's
okay.
Now I can't. Oh, okay. Now they've moved to the bottom. Okay. This is really weird for me. I'm having to move all of you around on my screen so that I can read what I have here on the slides.
Oh my
Okay,
goodness.
I think I've got it down now.
Okay.
So the underlying philosophy is something that I've taken from my book, which is currently in its 5th edition, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a Roadmap from Beginning to End. And I'm really grateful that so many students, including here at National, have found this book useful. So everything that I've drawn on in this presentation is actually from the book. So I'm going to read something that I wrote in the 5th edition. And this is what I write in terms of the underlying philosophy of qualitative research. Research is grounded in a philosophical position that is essentially constructivist in the sense that it is concerned with how the complexities of the social and cultural world are experienced, interpreted, and understood within a particular context and at a particular point in time. But what I haven't got here, and what I mentioned earlier, is that it's all about the research participants' experiences and how the researcher studies those and interprets them and represents the experience of the participants in the most authentic manner. Remember, trustworthy research is about authenticity. We can never misinterpret or misrepresent what our participants are telling us, even if it goes against our own assumptions, even if it goes against what we believe to be true. That is not the point. The point is, what are our participants experiencing based on what we're asking them about their experiences? So just before we get to the research paradigms and worldviews, which is part of the whole philosophical understanding of qualitative research, I'm going to stop. And Emily, if there are any questions, I'll take some of them at this point.
Absolutely. Of course, we did get a question in the chat already about the title of your book, so I'll be sure to pop that in the chat. And I know you mentioned the format of what you'll be covering today, a broad overview of the qualitative research process, but just wondering if you're going to touch at all on discussing the formats of a qualitative dissertation, the format.
I'm actually probably not going to be, simply because in this presentation, there are students here from all different schools and all different parts of the university, and each school has its own specific templates. I know in the School of Education, we have 2 tracks. We have the PhD, which is a 5-chapter dissertation, and then we have the ADE, the Applied Doctoral Experience, which is a 3-section dissertation. Very different in format. So I'm not going to be discussing formats here, but the CTL have amazing resources that explain all the different formats and the requirements.
I will also pop that information in the chat. At this time, then, aside from me putting that information in the chat, there's no other questions that I can see yet. Okay,
perfect. So we're going to move on then to the research paradigms or worldviews. So remember, I've spoken about the underlying philosophy, but the philosophy of qualitative research is based on certain worldviews or paradigms, and that's what I'm going to go into now. So just to clarify, a paradigm or worldview provides an orientation to the researcher that is informed and shaped by the field of study and the researcher's own beliefs and assumptions regarding their self and others, theoretical viewpoints, data quality considerations, and previous experience. Now, I know there's a lot going on in that sentence. And basically, I'm trying to point out that the paradigm or worldview is something that each of us carries within ourselves. We all have a view of the world, and we come to that view based on our experiences, our past history, our families, our cultural environments, our backgrounds, our upbringing, and the world that we live in today. We all develop perspectives, and that's what a worldview is. It's a perspective on the world. But with regard to qualitative research paradigms, there are essentially 4 core paradigms that inform research and shape the conceptualization, practice, and nature of the research. And these are the 4 paradigms that I'm going to discuss right now. The first is post-positivism, and many of you will recognize this as stemming from quantitative research, because post-positivism basically came after positivism, which is the scientific method, which maintains that all knowledge can be derived from direct observation and that logical inferences are based on observation or measurement. Now, you all agree that sounds very much like quantitative research, and it is. That's exactly what quantitative research is. Quantitative research is about logical inferences that one can draw based on what the researcher observes and measures, and then can speculate as to cause-effect relationships. The belief that there are laws or theories that govern the world, and these can be tested or verified, lies at the heart of post-positivism. So the laws and theories that govern the world can be tested quantitatively and verified. We can understand their reliability and validity, and we can develop a study on that basis. Also, post-positivist research is concerned with causal relationships, as I just said, cause-effect relationships. And the aim is to advance the relationship between variables, variable A and variable B. Sometimes there are more than 2 variables. A causes B causes C, B is related to D, etc., etc. So the variables are very much part of a post-positivist approach, which again is essentially quantitative. And this is very important, and this is where qualitative and quantitative research diverges dramatically, because post-positivism is based on the fact that being objective is an integral component of research, and the standards of reliability and validity are critical. So a quantitative researcher is expected to be objective, to put their own feelings and assumptions completely aside, which is one of the critiques of quantitative research from the perspective of qualitative research, because qualitative researchers say no one can be completely objective. We all have biases and assumptions inside of us based on our own experiences. So how can a person or a researcher ever be completely objective? But however, that is not the case for quantitative research, and objectivity is a main key point that is required in conducting a valid and reliable quantitative study. So just bear in mind that subjectivity piece. We're going to get to it a lot more when we talk about the researcher and the ways in which a qualitative researcher can account for their own subjectivities, because we all do carry those. If you for a moment try and be objective, try and put your feelings aside, try and put your assumptions aside, is anybody able to do that? If so, can you just raise your hand? Anyone raising hands, Emily? No? And that is because
I don't think so.
I've never actually asked that question in a presentation before, but if you think about it, it's very, very difficult to be truly objective. There's going to be some subjectivity no matter what, and that's why qualitative research brings to the fore this very rich acknowledgement of, yes, we are human. Yes, we do carry biases and assumptions. So the goal is to declare these, make them known instead of trying to hide them or imagine that we can put them aside. So that's positivism. And it's really interesting. And I've just sort of dumbed it down into 4 brief points, but there are entire books written on this. The next is pragmatism. And remember, these are all the worldviews that were around informing qualitative research. So we start with post-positivism, which was that quantitative approach. We then move towards pragmatism, where research is known to be contextually based. That means it's based on a context and a time and point in history or daily life. And the research employs both quantitative and qualitative approaches to understand the problem. So this is very interesting. And as you can see, it kind of hints toward mixed methods, where both qualitative and quantitative approaches are integrated to understand a problem or a phenomenon. The pragmatic approach believes that researchers should be free to choose the methods and procedures that best meet their purposes. And absolutely every researcher does have that prerogative. So if one feels not very strongly aligned to either qualitative or quantitative, you do have the option, or a researcher has the option, to conduct a mixed method study. But remember, mixed methods, and we tell our students this a lot, mixed methods is not just, oh, I'll have some qualitative and some quantitative and just mix them together any old way. It doesn't work like that. Mixed methods is a very, very specific and highly specialized form of research, because you have to be able to combine your qualitative and quantitative approaches and methods in a way that makes sense. It's not just a matter of putting them all together and kind of anything goes. It has to be very, very carefully articulated. And that's why a mixed method study is very intense. There are times where data is collected qualitatively. Then there are times that quantitative data is collected. Then the qualitative data has to be analyzed in a qualitative way. A quantitative data has to be analyzed in a very different way. So it's not just an easy method of putting them all together and that's it. Pragmatism also states that the research questions will best determine the methods used, and that is also part of qualitative research. The research questions really, together with the research problem and the research purpose, will provide a clue as to whether a study would be best suited to qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. And finally, pragmatists adopt multiple data collection and data analysis methods because they're using both the qualitative and the quantitative strands. So there will be multiple qualitative data collection and multiple or some quantitative data collection and data analysis, as I said a moment ago. So now remember, I'm just going to go back for a moment. We've looked at postpositivism, which is the scientific approach, which is the objective, reliable, valid approach. We've looked at pragmatism, and now we're going to look at social constructivism or interpretivism. Both of these terms refer to the same phenomenon, and this really is where qualitative research starts to take off and diverge from postpositivism and pragmatism. Because the central tenet is that reality is socially, culturally, and historically constructed, meaning that my reality is very different to anybody else's reality, and that's okay. And that nobody's reality is more true or right or accurate than anyone else's reality. We all have our own reality, and everybody's reality is real to them. And the reality that we carry with us, as I say in this first bullet point here, is socially or culturally or historically or a combination of all of those things constructed. So we all bring with us what we've experienced in our past, what we experience in our current lives, what we hope for in the future, what we've learned in school, what we've learned in our studies, what our family have taught us, etc. And that's why each of our reality is different. Social constructivist or interpretive research, which is qualitative research, attempts to understand social phenomena from a context-specific perspective, meaning everything happens within a context. My reality happens within my own context, my life. Your reality, Emily, will happen in your context, which is your life and your experiences. So nothing is free from context. How can we ever take ourselves out of our context? So the context that your research participants are living and working in is extremely important to their experiences, because it feeds into their experiences and makes those experiences real for them. Social constructivists also view research or inquiry, those words can be used interchangeably, as value-bound rather than value-free. And this goes back to the subjective-objective discussion. Objectivity means that you must discard all your values and you must be completely, in a way, like robot-like. You must be devoid of all your biases and assumptions and values. But qualitative research says no. A human being has values, and our values and our traditions and our thoughts and assumptions are really important in the way that we construct our reality and lead our lives. And so we look at human beings and research participants as coming with values, as coming with perspectives, and as human beings that are coming with their own ideas and experiences that are to be valued in the research process itself. So that said, it's the researcher's role, the qualitative researcher's role, to understand the multiple realities from the perspective of the participants themselves. And that's what I started off saying right in the beginning. And the only way to achieve this understanding is for the researcher to become totally involved in the reality of the participants and to interact with them in meaningful ways in order to be able to describe their experiences and conduct the research in a way that gives credence to the research participants' experiences and reality. So I just want to go back again so that we can just recap, because there's a lot going on here. The first was postpositivism, which is the quantitative. quantitative. We then moved to the pragmatist, which is more of the mixed methods approach. We then looked at social constructivism or interpretivism, which means that we're looking at people in context and looking at the way that they socially construct their reality based on their experiences. And now we're moving toward what is called critical theory. And critical theory is the way that a lot of qualitative research is going these days, because critical theory is a paradigm, which is also referred to as advocacy, liberatory, or participatory, which has a clear focus on social justice. And I've attended a lot of conferences on qualitative research over the years, specifically the Congress for Qualitative Inquiry, which is held every year at the University of Champaign-Urbana, outside of Chicago. And this is where all the great thinkers of qualitative research, and I'm not putting myself there at all, but all the great writers of qualitative research congregate every year to talk about qualitative research and how it has evolved from its early inception to where it is now. We're going to look at this a little bit later in this presentation, where I'm going to talk about and show you the different moments, what I call the moments of qualitative research, which are the historical moments in the development of qualitative research. So where we are right now in the world, the critical theory component of qualitative research is very strong. And there is in a lot of research these days, not all, and it doesn't mean that everybody has to look at their research study in this way. That's not the case. But there is a huge focus out there in the world on social justice. And this includes feminist perspectives, racialized discourses, queer theory, trans theory, disability inquiry, etc. This particular framework of critical theory started developing in the late 1980s from the critique that the post-positivist assumptions imposed unfair structural laws and theories that did not fit marginalized or disenfranchised individuals or groups. So the thinking was that the post-positivist approach was way too specific, way too much of like a dichotomy, like either A, either B, and it really didn't fit a lot of groups out there in the world who are marginalized because of their minority status. A critique of constructivism is that it also didn't go far enough in advocating for an action agenda to address the injustices and inequalities that are inflicted on those who have become the passive object of inquiry. I'm not going to go into this right now, but if you read up on qualitative research, and specifically in the Belmont Report, which is the gold standard of ethical research these days, in years back, and even possibly not that long ago, research was done on people rather than with people. And the participants in the research were just the object of the research. And that is not the case at all in terms of qualitative research today. Qualitative research really rejects that approach in considering that research participants are the passive object of inquiry. And the goal is to have the research participants as individuals whose experiences are paramount. As I said, we are here to explore and better understand the experiences of others. Now, unless one is doing an autoethnography, in which case that research focuses on your own experience as an individual. And that is one way that a researcher can do research on their own experiences. But for the most part, we are doing research with research participants who are generously giving us their experiences, either through interviews or being observed or through focus groups. And so we really do have to treat their experiences with respect and very authentically represent their experiences in our dissertations, in our articles, in our presentations, etc. Because that is really something that is like paramount in qualitative research, that consideration of respect for our research participants' experiences. As I said previously, even if we don't believe it ourselves, or even if it goes against or something that we may have thought or believed, this is not about us. It's about our research participants. So before we get to the characteristics of qualitative research, I want to stop here because we've covered quite a bit, and I just also want to check on the time. We're halfway through. So I want to take some questions now, Emily. Thanks.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, just revisiting what the Belmont piece was again. Can you say the name of that?
Yeah.
There was
the
a question
Belmont Report, BELMONT, was written in 1979, I think. I'm almost correct. It's easily accessible. Just Google Belmont Report and you'll see. It's an incredible report that goes back in history on all the different types of research that is not permissible. And it then talks about the three main criteria, which is justice. Oh, I'm just sorry, it's just slipping my mind for a moment. I'll talk about this all the time, but there are three principles: justice. Can someone help me maybe?
Yeah, actually, Jenna Johnson, who's awesome, actually popped in the link for the Belmont Report.
I mean, I've got it right here, but I'm not going to waste time for me looking it up. But there are three key principles. And in any qualitative study, the researcher is expected to address those three principles and show how you as the researcher are going to address those in your own study. Justice, respect, and beneficence. I think those are the three. And the Belmont Report also really outlines a lot of interesting studies that have taken place over the course of history where people have been used in experiments and where people have been used as objects, and that is no longer acceptable or at any level. And the Belmont Report was really developed to counteract those instances where people actually suffered as a result of research. And many studies were done throughout history that are absolutely unacceptable in today's world. So the Belmont Report is like a safety measure and the gold standard of ethical research today.
Absolutely. And that just some folks popped it. It looks like benevolence, respect for persons, and justice. So in case that rings a bell. And then Shirley Ritter popped in the chat. You'll read quite a bit about it in depth when you do your city yes, training.
Absolutely. The CITI training, which every single researcher has to do, and we have to update those every 2 years, I believe. And all of us as chairs and subject matter experts, everybody on the research committee has to be up to date with their CITI. It's quite an extensive course. It can take a number of hours to complete. And it really gives you a good refresher every 2 years of how to conduct ethical research and all the different ethical standards that are required.
And thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. I do have a question in the chat, going back to something that you mentioned about the reality of the participants. So the question is, you mentioned that the researcher must become involved in the reality of the participants. Could you discuss more about what involvement means? I've seen qualitative research that just collected and analyzed data from syllabi, but no real interaction with anyone. Could you maybe kind of expand on that?
I'm going to expand a little on that. It's a really important point. When I say deep involvement, it doesn't mean that you have to go into people's homes and sit with them and discuss things and really get to know their lives. But it does mean that you collect data from people on a one-to-one basis, either through interviews or observation, where you are actually in the space with your research participants. Now, because of social distancing, as we all know, over the last few years, a lot of research is now being done with social media and through Zoom, etc. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're not participating in your research participants' realities. And I actually write extensively on this in the 5th edition of my book, because a lot of different research agendas have come about since the pandemic. And there are new ways of collecting data as well, and also new ethical standards. Because we're collecting data from afar, a lot of new ethical standards and ethical concerns have come to the fore in the last few years. But it really means that the researcher, you're not doing a test on somebody, you're not doing an experiment on somebody, as may be the case in quantitative research, but you're a human being that's interacting with another human being. And that is what I mean by immersing yourself in the reality of somebody, even in terms of doing an interview. Even if you do a 1-hour interview with someone, or even a half-hour interview, you are still having a deep discussion with somebody about something that's important to them. And that is like being in their reality and trying to understand it. And that is really the essence of qualitative research.
Thank you so much for expanding on that. One more question so far that's popped up. What is the distinction between positivism and post-positivism?
Positivism was the very scientific standard, and post-positivism developed from positivism. So there's not a whole lot of difference between them. Positivism was the very beginning, and then post-positivism just added some more human type element to it. Again, there's a lot written about it. I didn't want to go into too much detail on that because both of those really apply to quantitative research, but I wanted to show the development from positivism or post-positivism through pragmatism, social constructivism, and finally to critical theory, which is that more of an advocacy, liberatory, social justice agenda.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. I appreciate that.
Of course.
And then someone is asking about help with archival data. How do you know what you've gathered is okay to use? Any feedback for that? I know it's not quite on topic, but
archival data is like any data. There's no right or wrong. We don't ever have a standard to say whether something is research worthy or not. If you're using documents or archival data, documents are really a great way and a really respectable method of collecting data in qualitative research. It's one data collection method. You'd be analyzing documents or visual images, photographs, even social media, all from the perspective of a researcher and trying to better understand it. So all archival data, whether it's documents or photography or whatever, again, we have to rely on the legitimacy of it and the context in which you're gathering it. So if you're gathering it from an organization or from an individual, you would know and have to know where you're getting your documents from, and that gives it legitimacy to begin with. So you may find documents that are not legitimate or that go against what you're thinking, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong, and you have to analyze them according to your research questions and your research agenda. But for the same matter, you could say that research participants are not truthful in their answers. We cannot control that. We can only hope that what our research participants tell us is accurate according to their reality, even if we think it's not. And sometimes research participants are reluctant to actually tell us the truth. It might be too hurtful, might be embarrassing. They may not be comfortable with telling us the truth. So these are all limitations of qualitative research, and these are part of what quantitative research, when we had the paradigm wars many years ago, the quantitative researchers would say, this is not a reliable method of collecting data because your research participants can tell you anything they want, and how do you know it's truthful? But we trust that what our participants are telling us is what they want to tell us, and that's the bottom line. We can only go with what people want to tell us if they agree to participate in our studies. And then we analyze what they tell us according to what we believe to be true and authentic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. That's it for right now for the questions in the chat.
Okay, great questions. I really appreciate all those questions. So keep them coming, because in the next half hour, we're going to go through the main characteristics of qualitative research, first in terms of setting up a study. And this kind of speaks to dissertation research as well. Research questions are typically open-ended. You never ask a research question. Now remember, research questions are not interview questions. It's your study's research questions that are based on your problem and purpose. So when I say open-ended, it means that there's not a yes/no answer. You wouldn't ask a research question like, are all dogs black? Or are all dogs spotted? Because then the question would simply be yes or no. You would ask a question like, to what extent are the majority of dogs spotted? Or to what extent are the majority of dogs multicolored? And then you'd be getting more at like a more broad and nuanced answer as opposed to a yes/no answer. Next, the sample selection in qualitative research is purposeful or purposive. Both of those words really mean the same thing, rather than random. In this way, the researcher selects participants who meet certain criteria that the researcher has determined. I want to study people that have been teachers for 3 years. They teach in K through 12, and they are all qualified and have been to grad school in the years between 1990 to 1995. Just giving it a silly example, but those are the criteria that me as a researcher may want to study. So the qualitative researcher sets their own parameters or criteria for who they want to be in their study, and they develop or gather a sample based on those criteria. I had a talk with a student of mine about 2 hours ago on his sample selection. And we were talking specifically about this, about what kind of people he wants to include in his study and how he's going to go about creating a purposeful sample, because it's not going to be random if it's a qualitative study. Data are gathered directly from research participants themselves in their natural setting. And that speaks back to what we talked about, immersing yourself in the reality of participants. We don't use experiments. We don't use statistics. We are using instruments like interviews or focus groups that we apply to people in their natural setting, in their homes, in their schools, in their work environment, where they work and live. Researchers do not bring individuals into a lab, and they typically send out instruments for individuals to complete. So we would send out or apply an interview or set up a Zoom with an interview, but we don't typically send out surveys or long questionnaires as would be done in a quantitative study. And we certainly don't do any research in a laboratory. We are not doing any sort of experimental or quasi-experimental research in qualitative inquiry. And this close-up information is gathered by talking directly to people and seeing them behave and act within their specific context. And that is a major characteristic of qualitative research. With all that said, the researcher is the instrument of data collection and data analysis, meaning that the researcher is the key person that collects and analyzes data. There are no statistics involved. There is no actual measurement involved. The researcher is the instrument in this case. So these are the characteristics of qualitative research in terms of setting up your study. Next, we're going to look at the qualitative research, the characteristics of qualitative research in terms of the goals and objectives of research. The first one is what I've spoken about quite a lot here already tonight, and that is the goal is not to produce truths that can be generalized to other people or settings, but rather to develop descriptive context-relevant findings. This makes it possible for readers to decide whether these findings can apply to their own contexts and communities. So a big difference here between qualitative and quantitative research is that we're not looking for generalizability. We're not looking at all to generalize our findings. We're looking rather at transferability, which is one of the trustworthiness criteria, so that readers can decide for themselves whether your study makes sense to them and if they can apply the findings to their own context. Research ethics and researcher reflexivity are critical to qualitative inquiry, and the researcher is expected to be fully transparent about their worldview and positionality, as this significantly shapes the research process right from the beginning up until the end. And I wish that we had more time to talk about researcher positionality. And in fact, I think, Emily, am I right? I've given a total webinar on that once before. And that's probably, and I'm sure it is with CTL. So if anybody is interested in positionality, Emily can guide you to the CTL, awesome, with a link to that, that resource and other resources. There are books written on positionality. It's very interesting and a very critical component of qualitative research. And in fact, in my 5th edition, I talk about positionality statements, and I'm requiring these of my qualitative students more and more, because it gives the student researcher an opportunity to state their own experiences, their own reality, their own biases and assumptions that may in effect and do in effect govern the study and impact the findings. Because remember, we're coming at our findings, even though we're trying to be as authentic as possible, we are necessarily bringing in our human nature, our biases and assumptions, and our own experience. The way that qualitative research is presented is through thick description, which is a term coined by Clifford Geertz in 1973. Thick description is achieved by thoroughly describing the study setting, the research participants themselves, and their experiences. So remember, thick description is that very deep and intricate description and the detail that is required for somebody else to really understand what you studied and what you came away with. The researcher, the qualitative researcher, triangulates by making use of multiple different data sources and data methods, and these are reported as part of the study's methodology. Remember, the data sources are the people from whom you gather your data. You don't do research with one person unless you're doing a very, very intricate ethnography or narrative inquiry. Typically, you use more than one person, which creates your research sample, and your methods that you use are usually triangulated in terms of there being at least 2 data collection methods. So you would not ever only use interviews, you would not only ever use observation, you'd use a combination of interviews, observation, focus group, open-ended surveys, etc. So at least 2 methods would make for a stronger qualitative study. And the researcher does not rely on any single data source, meaning that you don't only rely on one person or one source of data. You triangulate in all these multiple ways to make sure that you've covered all the different aspects and nuances of the phenomenon that you're studying. So we've looked at the characteristics, in terms of setting up the study. Then we move to the characteristics in terms of goals and objectives. Now we're going to look at the characteristics of qualitative research in terms of analysis and interpretation. So as I said, triangulation, which means using data and data method and methods of data collection from different natures, addresses the 4 trustworthiness criteria, which are credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. Analysis of data is not linear, it's multi-layered, and it's iterative, and this builds upon itself until a meaningful interpretation is achieved. And this is really a source of frustration for many student researchers, because data analysis is not linear like it is in quantitative research. It doesn't go on a single path and you just start and you end and it's all neat and tidy. It's not like that at all. It's iterative, meaning there's back and forth. There's going back to certain ideas, then jumping forward to other ideas, putting aside previous ideas, etc. So there's a lot of give and take in qualitative data analysis. Qualitative researchers typically work inductively, building categories and themes from the bottom up by organizing the data into increasingly more abstract units of information. So you start with codes and you then develop categories and then themes, and then your findings emerge from all of that. So it really is starting from the bottom up, from more concrete codes to abstract interpretation. This inductive process illustrates working back and forth between the themes until the researcher has established a comprehensive set of themes that is workable and that makes sense in terms of the findings. Then deductively, so that's all inductive. Then deductively, the researcher looks back at the data to determine what additional evidence can support each theme and determine if saturation has been achieved. And again, saturation is a huge concept in qualitative research, and I'm not going to go into that now, but it means that no more new data is coming about. That when saturation has been achieved, you can be pretty sure that you've looked at the data from all different angles and you've really not left any stone unturned. It's when you start seeing the same things over and over that you realize that you've achieved saturation, because there's no more new data coming out. So although the process begins inductively, deductive thinking also plays a role in moving the analysis forward. And remember, we always have to tie our findings back to the literature and the previous research, and that is part of the deductive component. So just going back again, and I like to just do this because there's so much going on here. The first is we looked at the characteristics in terms of setting up the study. Then we looked at the characteristics in terms of goals and objectives. Then we looked at the characteristics in terms of analysis and interpretation. And now we're going to go on to researcher reflexivity. But just before we do, before I show that slide, I just want to stop for questions.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Couple of questions that I do have, and they popped up in the chat earlier. So again, folks, forgive me if I missed something, just bring my attention to it. Happy to go back. But the first question I have has to do with the questionnaires, and you touched on it a bit earlier, but had centered around the question piece, excuse me. Can open-ended questions be supported by questionnaires to increase validity?
Well, firstly, there is no such thing as validity in qualitative research. So
Okay.
We don't use that term at all. We don't use reliability and validity. We focus on trustworthiness, which is credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so I just want to make that very clear.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that clarification. Would we state anything in our dissertation about our position or reflexivity?
Absolutely. A positionality statement is a great way to state your position, to state your approach, to state your perspectives, to explain your experiences, how your experiences have brought you to this research, and the ways in which your own personal biases may play in. So by being very transparent and very self-reflective, you would create a much stronger study rather than trying to put that aside and imagine that it's not happening.
Okay.
And there are lots of great articles written on positionality and positionality statements, as I said. And some of those sources may be in that presentation, Emily, that I did previously. I can't really remember.
That's okay. That's fair. Where in the dissertation would positionality statement go? Do you know if that matters?
Usually it goes in your methodology section. So
Okay.
right where you talk about what methods and methodology you're using, you would also state your positionality statement up front. But then you would come back to that in your findings and interpretation. You'd refer back to it. So you'd revisit it later on in your dissertation. So remember, a dissertation is it's a very structured document, but it's also very creative in terms of the way that you place certain sections. But remember, every school and every university have its own template. So there's leeway, but there are also parameters. And this is something that you would just discuss with your chair.
Thank you. And I did pop in the resource centers for the applied doctorate and then the dissertation center as well too for reference. Question about this. Do you ask the interviewees about their potential bias?
Absolutely. You could, that would be a great question to ask as an interview question. If you're looking at a phenomenon, say school leadership, you could absolutely ask participants, when you're asking them about what they think about school leadership and what it means to them, you really are uncovering their biases. But you could also ask them right out, like, do you have any biases against such and such or about such and such? Or what are your assumptions? Sometimes we don't like to use the word biases because it's quite strong, but you can frame it in terms of what are your assumptions around this issue? What do you think about this? That's a typically great qualitative question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. I know we have about 5-6 minutes left, so I thought, no. I know if we go,
how did that happen?
If we happen to go a few minutes over, that's okay. But I wanted to make sure we're able to move forward into.
Yeah. So let me move forward then, because I don't want to miss any of this. But I'm happy to stay on a little longer if, and I completely understand if people have to drop off. And this presentation will be made available through the CTL.
Yes. But
I can stay on. I'm not in a rush. So, but let me try and be respectful of people's time and just be as expedient as I can here. I think by right now, I think we all acknowledge that this is a huge field, very difficult to condense even the fundamentals into one presentation. And you'll notice when Dr. Boberg and I present on designs, it's going to be the same. We might only be presenting on designs, but really that's a huge area. Every single design can have books written on it. So we're going to try our best to do that in 1 hour as well. So researcher reflexivity is really where the researcher reflects on their role in the study. This is part of the positionality statement, explicitly identifying biases and values. The reflexivity means commenting on your past experiences, and B, how your experiences may potentially shape your interpretation of the study's findings. So everything that's on this slide here, and I'm not going to read all of it, really goes into what a researcher should be reflecting on to make sure that they are being as transparent and authentic and open as possible. Doesn't mean that they're being unbiased, and doesn't mean that they're being objective. They're simply being transparent to make clear to their readers who they are and what they bring to the study. And researcher reflexivity is honestly a key integral part of qualitative research. I don't believe that it applies to quantitative research at all, because if one is expected to be objective, there's nothing really to comment on. You claim that you're being unbiased, and that's that. This is the evolving landscape of qualitative inquiry, which, as I've hinted to, has evolved over many years in terms of historical moments or phases. And I'm not going to go through all of these because you will see them on the slides and in the presentation. But these are the different qualitative moments that started happening in the early 1900s, right up until the present moment, which is this one over here. And this is one I do want to focus on for a moment. So the moment that we find ourselves currently in is actually the 8th moment of qualitative research. And this present moment, or 8th moment, is characterized by renewed calls for social justice and critical conversations around the following areas: race, identity, gender, gender preference, class, democracy, globalization, freedom, complexity, and community, among others. There are many others as well. I just picked on these, but there are many other areas that a critical study can focus on. And as I said earlier, if you remember, this is really all sounding like critical theory, and it is. And that's what the present moment of qualitative research is focused on. It's focused on bringing justice to previously minoritized individuals or groups who may have been excluded from the research process in fair and equitable ways, and really giving them a voice in having their experiences known. And that really is the bottom line of critical theory, where we give voice to people that may have been silenced in the past. And this is a really exciting time for qualitative research, for me in particular, because I see such great opportunity here to really make a difference in people's lives and in the lives of communities through your research. So don't think that your research is just a dissertation. You can see your research as something that will really make a difference. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking. It doesn't have to be something that is like earth-shattering. But even if you change one person's life, that is making a difference. And I want to read what I write in this book as well. This is the 5th edition of my book on this page 462. What is the potential social, cultural, and political impact of our research? Moreover, should we be content just to report our findings, or should we instead be striving to evoke awareness, provoke and invoke action to bring about change through our research, thereby potentially making an authentic and meaningful real-world difference? Declaring our positionality and exposing how we show up makes for fully transparent and trustworthy research. This also conveys the message of researcher humility and vulnerability in the space we share with our research participants, so that as we write about their stories and their experiences, we deeply consider the possibilities in which to most authentically portray the humanity of the other. In this way, our research can indeed become a vehicle for meaningful social change. And I think I wrote this in the afterword of my book. So this is the book that I've been drawing on in this presentation. It's the 5th edition of my book. And I believe it is available in the NCU library as well. I think currently the 4th edition is available, and I think this one will be available very shortly because it is currently in print. And I just wanted to take final questions, and also just to remind everybody of the February 2nd presentation that Dr. Boberg and I will be conducting on qualitative research designs, and greatly welcome everybody here to attend that and to tell others about it, because I think it'll be a very informative topic for all of our qualitative students. So right now, I'm just going to open up to some final questions.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, I could have dragged this out. And there's so much to discuss here, but I really try to condense it in a way that would pack into 1 hour.
Which is an accomplishment in itself when we're talking about a broad overview of qualitative research.
It is, actually.
So one question here, should a researcher who falls into one of these present moment characteristics conduct a study about it?
Oh, this one here, the present moment?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, critical qualitative research, or even non-critical, if you're just doing constructivist from the perspective of a research participant, we all do research around these areas. If you think about it, a lot of the research that we're conducting here at National University and previously at North Central had to do with many of these issues. But it's not to say that you have to. Everybody does research on something that's important or passionate to them. And usually it stems from our own experiences, either personally and or professionally. And the point of research is to do something that's important to you. You're going to spend a good many years on a dissertation, and you want this to be something that is special to you and meaningful to you and or your community. So definitely pick a topic and a problem, a research problem that is something that is research worthy generally, but also very important and close to what you have experienced in your life.
And thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Before you advance the slide, would you mind just popping it back to the moments or the history?
Yep.
Thank you.
That one?
Yes, thank you. I know we didn't get to go into detail on this, but
Yeah.
I did have a few questions about that in the chat.
Sure.
And then I'm scrolling up. I don't think I missed a question in the chat.
About these moments, you mean?
Nope, that was it. Actually, we're all good. I don't think I missed a question about the moment piece.
And the moment piece is also expanded in my book, and it's also going to be on these slides for anybody to see. But it really is just like a historical sort of like timeline of how things started off in the early 1900s. It started off with positivist paradigms and objective science, and then moved into like a more constructivist vein. And as you can see, the seventh moment, which kind of goes from 2000 to 2004, is about more intentional conversations about the limitations and possibilities of race, quality, gender, sexuality, and location. And then it moves to the really critical moment that we find ourselves in now. And remember, research also follows trends in the world. So right now, if you think about where the world is now, the kind of questions people are asking, this is why we're doing research on these issues, because this is what's pertinent in society today. If you look back at the first moment, people in the early 1900s were more concerned with quantitative approaches. They wanted to know about reliable and valid knowledge. They had in their mind truths. What is a truth? There can only be one truth, right? Well, we don't believe that anymore. We know that there are multiple truths. My truth is different to Emily's truth, which is different to somebody else's truth. And that doesn't mean that my truth is more important. It just means that we all come with our own truth based on our own experience. And that's the beauty of qualitative research, is that it really is forgiving in terms of acknowledging each and every single person's living experience and trying to understand it in a way that makes sense and in a way that will help others understand it. That's really the key point. We want our readers to understand what we've studied so that they better understand issues around all of these areas, and that they can better understand the specific study that you or I conduct around any of these things or anything else. So we want to shed light and add to the knowledge base on whatever study we're conducting. And that is really the point of research, to share knowledge, to build knowledge, and to deepen understanding so that we can have a more understanding and equitable world for all of us. I don't know how better to say that.
That is it in a nutshell, Dr. Bloomberg. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees as well. Some really great questions. And if you don't mind just going to the last slide with the next presentation with Dr. Bloomberg as well too in February, just so folks...
I have to say that I'm very excited about this upcoming presentation. Dr. Janet Boberg is a colleague of mine. We work together on a lot of dissertation committees, and she has a very deep knowledge of qualitative research designs. And so I think that what we're going to be presenting, we're busy working on the presentation currently, I think that people are going to find very interesting, and it really leads on nicely from this presentation today, because this is really the fundamentals and it's really a broad overview. That one's going to be much more specific. We're going to be looking at case study, ethnography, narrative inquiry, phenomenology, and can't remember the other one.
That's okay.
So that's a surprise.
Okay. And one little surprise.
I know what it is. I know, it's grounded theory.
Okay. Fantastic.
So we're going to be looking at those. We're going to be drawing on certain great resources that we've come across, including Creswell's book, which is used in a lot of our qualitative courses here at National. And we're going to have a lot of Q&A and a lot of discussion around all these areas, because everybody who's doing a qualitative study does have to choose a research design. We, both Dr. Boberg and I, are not a fan of kind of no design, because that doesn't strengthen a study. And there's some debate out there in the world about using a generic approach as to a specific approach. And everybody's free to choose whatever approach they like. My personal preference, and I know Dr. Boberg as well, is to really ground your study in a very well thought out design, because in that way, you know what the parameters are in terms of data collection and data analysis, because it's not just like an anything goes approach. It's very structured, it's very rigorous, and that's where the rigor and trustworthiness of qualitative research comes in. So I don't want to go too much into that, but that's what we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. And Dr. Bloomberg, I look forward to that as well too. And then to all of our participants, as we've shifted our webinar series to a Skill Up series, please don't hesitate to provide us feedback in our survey that we send to you. We're always looking for ways to help you as students, staff, and faculty, and provide tools so that you can be successful in your journey. So with that being said, if there's any other follow-up questions, when I send you the email with a recording of this and the PDF version of the PowerPoint, please don't hesitate to reply with a follow-up question. We are happy to help. So until the next time, I hope you all have a great evening and take care.
Thanks so much, Emily. Thanks to you and CTL, and thanks to everybody that attended here. I see a lot of people that I know, a lot of students, current students and past students of mine, and many other people. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their busy schedules to attend and to participate. And I learned so much from these, as I said. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Good evening.
Good
Bye-bye.
evening. Bye, everybody. Bye.